Well, this morning I want to just start by reading Joshua chapter number 24, starting at verse number 14, as we continue on in our new series entitled What to Do, and we're going to look at what to do when you're at a crossroad. Joshua 24, just two verses, 14 and 15. Now fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your ancestors worshiped beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day. Would you shout, choose? Choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve. Whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. And Joshua says this, he says, but as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. Most of us have heard the story of the Israelites and Moses bringing them out of captivity. And I'll just kind of give a little bit of background and get us up to where we are in the scripture. Moses was chosen by God, and that we could be here for the rest of the morning. Just the idea that God chooses us. How many of you are grateful that he chose you? God chooses Moses to go down to Egypt to deliver his chosen people called the Israelites from the hand of Pharaoh. The Israelites had been enslaved for over 400 years. But God had made some promises to the Israelites, his chosen people. He made a covenant with a man by the name of Abram, who he changed his name into Abraham, and he was married to this woman by the name of Sarai, whose name was changed to Sarah. But God makes a covenant with them and says that you all are, through you, the entire world is going to be blessed. That you're gonna outnumber, your descendants are going to outnumber the sand on the beaches, the stars in the sky. I'm going to make you into a mighty, mighty nation. But here they are, slaves in Egypt, with the promise over their life of being a great nation, of blessing, that through them the entire world was going to be blessed. They weren't even a nation. They were merely slaves. You know, it's interesting because I'm sure that God has made some promises and there they were, and they remembered the promise that God made to them. But there they were in Egypt, and I'm sure after maybe 50 years or 40 years, they probably stopped talking about the promise. They probably kind of put that to the background, and they were probably even wondering if the promise was ever going to come about. They probably at this point, after year 150 or 200, can you imagine? And your grandparents, and they started to talk about it, but we're seeing no fruit of it. We're seeing no evidence. We're seeing no change. We don't see how this circumstance of what God promised is going to come into fruition. But when God speaks a thing, he has a way of bringing it to pass. They probably were feeling hopeless and forgotten and wondering if God was going to come through. I just want to encourage somebody today as we make our way on to Joshua, who feels like maybe that God has forgotten about them, that they're beginning to give up on what they've been praying for, and you've been feeling like you don't know if the situation is going to change or the tide is going to change or your circumstances are going to be turned around. I want to encourage you today that every single word of God is true. Would you shout, "It's true"? His promise, when he makes a promise, he will come through. And just because it looks bleak, just because things aren't turning in your favor right now, it doesn't mean that God isn't working it out for your good. Would you encourage somebody and tell them God's up to something good? God's up to something good. I'm sure if the 400 years they're saying this is our lot, we just need to accept this. We just need to settle into this place. Forget about the promises. And the devil is a liar. And I don't want you to get comfortable just because you don't see what you've been believing God for and what you've been praying for and what you've been asking for. I want you to continue to believe that if God said it, then I'm going to believe it. That I walk by faith and not by sight. So God sends Moses to deliver his people. Even though God had already secured their victory, God says that I'm going to bring them out and I'm going to bring them into this promised land, but it didn't come without some resistance and some adversity. It didn't come without Pharaoh's heart being hardened and him refusing to let them go. And this is what puzzles me, because God had already secured their victory. If God has already secured my victory, then why do I have to fight all the time? If God has already secured my victory, then what's this resistance that I have to go through? But I've learned that it's through resistance that God builds my spiritual faith. And sometimes he has to put us in a place where he promises it, but then he's going to put you in a position of resistance so that when you walk into the promise, your faith has been built up. So sometimes we confuse it and we're saying, well, maybe God didn't say it, or maybe God's not strong enough to do it. No, it's not that God didn't say it. It's not that he's not strong enough to do it. He's just preparing you so that you be strong enough to handle it. Sometimes the blessing can become a burden if you're not ready for it. You've seen people reach certain heights of success, but because their integrity wasn't there, because their character wasn't there, because their life wasn't there, because they didn't have the stability and were rooted and grounded in the rock, and then they get there and they come Humpty Dumpty, sat on a... But he had a great fall. And so sometimes God has to put the adversity there and the resistance there, and it's simply to build us up for where he is taking us. Well, long story short, Moses leads the Israelites through the desert for 40 years. 40 years. Now, when I was a kid, I didn't realize that it was just a few days' journey. I'm thinking, man, that's a big desert. 40 years. Moses is leading them through the desert. And it wasn't a 40-year journey. So why does it have to take 40 years? Well, the Bible says that they were complaining, they were unfaithful, and because of that, God had to delay what he already had in motion. I'm going to let that sink in for you for a moment there, because sometimes we think that God's delay is his denial, but really he's waiting on... Am I talking to anybody this morning? You feel like you're spinning your wheels and you're getting nowhere fast. And it's not that God has a future for you. It's not that he doesn't have plans for you. It's not that he doesn't have a promise for you. It's not that he hasn't set things up for you. The problem is he's waiting on you to walk in line with his will and his purpose and his plan for your life. Maybe you've been complaining so much that he's delaying things. Maybe you've been talking the blessing away from your life. Maybe it's because you've been unfaithful to him. One minute you're with him, and the next minute when it's not coming fast enough or quick enough or the way that you want it to come, then you're turning your heart another way. And because of that, the blessing is being delayed. The Bible describes the Israelites as stiff-necked and disobedient. Stiff-necked. Stiff-necked. That's when you want to do it your way. That's when you want it to go your way. That's when you, instead of trusting God, you figured that you could do it better than God. You want things now instead of trusting in his timing. You're creating this delay simply because of the way that you're responding to the will and the purpose and the plan of God. Too many times the blessings that God has for us are not denied but delayed because of our unwillingness to submit. Would you say submit? Moses gets the Israelites to the promised land, but he's not permitted to enter it. This blows my mind. Moses goes down and represents God. The plagues and all of this, he's back and forth, leads them out of Egypt. They finally get free. God delivers them. He leads them out. God uses Moses to perform miracles, parting Red Seas, walking on dry land. They were hungry. He speaks. God sends manna from heaven, quail when they get tired of the manna. All of these things, but God says, Moses, you won't be able to enter into the promised land because of one incident. God tells Moses that the people want some water. God tells Moses, Moses, I want you to speak to this rock. But instead, Moses strikes the rock. Because of that one decision, he couldn't enter into the promised land. This is the same Moses that went up on the mountaintop and met with God. This was the same Moses that was in front of the burning bush, and God says, take off your shoes, you're standing on holy ground. This is the same Moses that God gives the 10 Commandments to. This is the same Moses that was faithful over those 40 years to lead them out. But one decision, one act of disobedience, one act of frustration to the will and the purpose and the plan of God. I'm saying that because, sometimes we don't realize that it only takes one. We become so cavalier with the choices and the decisions that we make because we're not feeling the impact of it right now. But what we don't understand is life is connected. And what you do today is going to show up on tomorrow. And so we can become so cavalier in our decisions and in our choices and doing things. And we know what God's will is, but I'm going to do it another way. I know what his word says, but I'm going to modify it for my situation. I know what his will is, but I'm going to do it anyway. One decision impacted profoundly his future and what he was able to do in God. I'm just wondering if you've taken a moment to just take stock of how you're living and what you're doing and the decisions that you're making, and understanding that life is connected. All of your decisions have an impact on the other. And here's the bigger thing. Not only do our decisions impact our lives, but it impacts everybody connected to us. Well, I'm just doing my own thing. This got nothing to do with them. Yes, it does. Because we're connected. If you're a member of this church, what you do affects all of us. If you're a member of a family, what you do affects everybody. And here's the thing that you got to understand. It's affecting your children's children that aren't even here yet. They're not even born yet. But what you're doing now is setting the table for what's to come. I'm just saying that to say you ought to think about how you're living. All right, let's get to Joshua. God uses Moses. Moses makes a bad decision. And as a result of that, he's not able. He can bring them all the way to the promised land, but can't lead them into the promised land. Can you imagine being that close? So God says, what we're going to do is we're going to use your young apprentice. We're going to use Joshua. And Joshua is going to lead them into the promised land. Well, Joshua leads them into the promised land, but there's a problem with the promised land. The very land that God promised them is full of a bunch of other people. And they don't know about the promise that God made to these people. As far as they're concerned, this is my land. I won't be singing on Saturday. As far as they're concerned, this is their land. But God made a promise. Do you see what God is doing here? Because I don't. Why would you promise me somebody else's land and not tell them about it? Why would you promise me somebody's land and you know they hate my guts? No, I'm talking about they want to kill me when they see me coming. They built all of these houses and all of these cities. They've got all of these farms and all of these things. And God says, yep, they built it all. And while you were in slavery, they were building your home. And they were setting up your farm. And they were putting some things in motion, not knowing that it was all for... Isn't that awesome? Somebody right now is warming up your desk. Somebody's holding your position. What? Thank you. Somebody's cleaning your house right now. Thank you. Go ahead and add that addition. I'm going to need that space. Hook it up. God says, no. You see it one way, where I see it another. They're setting it up for you. All right, God, then this going to be easy then. No, it's not going to be easy though. So they had to go in there and they had to fight. You know, sometimes we want to throw in the towel real easy. We get so discouraged so fast. Well, God, he's going to do this. Well, but there's some enemies there. There's some people that are saying this is theirs and they're not going to give it to me. And you need to know that you have an adversary and his name is Satan. And he's going to do everything he can to work against you. Regardless of what God says, he wants you to think that what God said isn't going to come true. That what God said he can't do, he won't be able to perform it. But the devil is a liar. It's not going to come to pass. You won't be able to get this. You're not qualified for this. No, I'm not. That's what makes it so awesome. That's what's going to make it so great that when I get there, I'll be able to say, it was the Lord. It was the Lord. You know, I know without a doubt. And the Israelites showed up and they were slaves. These were trained armies. Those jokers showed up and God said, all right, here's what y'all going to do. Here's the battle plan. Sing, y'all. Now, y'all go ahead and sing. Now, y'all just go ahead and march around this here property. Yeah. Do it like 7 times. And they're like, oh, God. I done got us out here. They didn't know nothing about weapons. But what they didn't understand is the weapons of their warfare were not carnal, but they were mighty for the pulling down of strongholds, to demolish every argument and every thought and every idea that would try to exalt itself above the name and the purpose and the plan of God. And so all I got to do is say, in Jesus' name, I've got victory. And walls come tumbling down without one target practice. But his word becomes a sword in my hands, a sword in my mouth. His faith becomes a shield for me. His righteousness becomes my breastplate. My head is covered with salvation. My mind is being transformed, being renewed. And here they are. They go into the promised land, and Joshua leads them in there, and they conquer all of these enemies and these foreign lands and these foreign countries and these foreign people, and they worshiped all kinds of other gods. But God said, I'm the true and living God, and I'm going to give you victory over every single one of them. And they demolished them all, and they all have victory, and they inhabit the land, and Joshua divvies it up, and this tribe lives over here, and you get this land, and this tribe gets this land, and you get this land, and everything is all set up, and everything is in place, and they're enjoying everything. And Joshua now is at the end of his life. That's where we are in the text. He's at the end of his life, and he calls all of the leaders together, and he calls all of the people together, and he gathers them together, and he has this conversation with them. Joshua says, I want you to make a choice today. Hear me, people of God. I want you to make a choice. Essentially, what Joshua is saying is that you're at a crossroad. And here's the thing, you'll be at this crossroad every day. You'll be at this crossroad. Every day you wake up, you're going to be at a crossroad. Every situation you come, you're going to be at a crossroad. And Joshua says, I want you to settle this once and for all. He says, you have a choice. You got a choice. You can serve the God of your ancestors. He says the gods that Abraham's father worshiped. You can choose to serve those gods if you want. He says you've got other choices. You can look around even in the land, the Amorites and the Hivites and the Hittites and the mosquito bites. All of them are here. And they all have their gods, and you can pick one of them or three of them, and they had so many gods. There's a smorgasbord of gods that you can choose from. But he says, you got to make a choice. You got to make a choice. From time to time, my wife she's been doing so well. She's been eating really well and taking good care of herself, and that was a gift that we wanted to give to one another. Just our health was the gift that we wanted to give to one another, and just get in shape so that we can enjoy one another. But every once in a while, we go to this place. I think it's Baskin Robbins. I don't know if y'all familiar with that ministry. They have a ministry down the street from us, and we show up there for worship every once in a while. Bring an offering when we come, and we don't show up empty-handed. We bring an offering. But do you know what Baskin Robbins is famous for? Ice cream. But you know what makes them famous? All of the flavors. Have you gone in to see the flavors at Baskin Robbins? I mean, they've got a flavor. I wrote some down. They got a mango breeze. Some of y'all going right from here to lemon custard, German chocolate cake. Now that one's a sin. If you get the German chocolate, you're sinning. You're sinning if you get that. They got one called quarterback crunch. I don't even know what's in that one. I don't even know what's in that one. But I love it because there are just so many options, so many choices. And do you know what I end up getting? As many as I can. Give me a little of that. Give me a little of that. Give me a little. And then, sometimes you try to get bold. I got my mind made up. I know exactly what I'm going to get. No. I'm resolute. I'm going for this one. Then you get there and you start seeing this one over here and it starts calling your name. And you're seeing this one over here. The thing about it is there's so many choices. And so I end up getting a mixture. A little bit of this, a little bit of that. Because of all the choices, it's hard for me to commit to just one. The Israelites had the same problem. There were so many different flavors around that it was hard to just pick one. It becomes hard. They want a taste of this and a taste of that. Sometimes we want a mixture. I'll take a little bit of Jesus, but I'm gonna need a little bit of And we want a mixture. Why limit myself to one when I could have all of these? Joshua says, you got to make a choice. You can have a mixture of all of those, but you can't mix God in with it. We can't serve God and convenience. You know how we want to serve God, but then we also want to serve convenience. So if it's not difficult, then I'll come to church. If the party isn't going on Saturday night, then I'll come to church. If the soccer game isn't, then I'll come to church. If my car doesn't need to be washed, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to mess with anybody. Just if it's convenient for me, then I'll serve him. But I'd rather serve God and convenience. Can we mix the two together? Or you know what? I'd rather serve God and material possessions. I want God, but this is just as important to me as well. And so I'm setting up my life so that I can go after God, but there are times where I got to give God a break because I'm going after this too, and this is on same par as God. And so I want a mixture of the two. Or sometimes I want to serve God and pleasure. As long as it feels good, then I'm with God. But sometimes I got to go to other places to get the high I'm looking for. I'm going to come back over here. I want to serve God as long as I'm happy. If I'm not happy, then I don't want to serve him. Because happiness is just as, that's the other God that I want in my life. I want this pleasure. I want this good feeling. I want to be able to hang out. I want to be able to have a good time. And if God gets in the way of that, I'll take a little bit of him, but I want a little bit of pleasure on the side. Because they're just as important. And the truth of the matter is, all of us are tempted to serve something else or someone else. And here's the deal, we're all gonna serve God. The question is, which one? We all gonna worship. We all gonna bow down before something. We all gonna give our money to something, our time to something, our energies to something, our talents to something. The question is, which God? Joshua says, which one is it for you? Who will you serve? He says, you've got to make a decision today. You've got to choose. Because this isn't Baskin Robbins. You can't have a little bit of God and he must be Lord. He must be Lord. So what do I do when I'm at a crossroad? I'm going to close. What do I do when I'm at a crossroad and I'm tempted to worship or serve another? Here's what Jesus says. Jesus says, you can't serve two masters. He says, you just can't. You're going to be tempted to, but you just won't be able to serve two masters. Here's what he says. Here's what Jesus says in Matthew 6:24. He says, no one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. You can't have a mix. When it comes to God, it's either all of him or none of him. Jesus goes on to say you can't serve both God and money. You can't have two masters in your life. And so he says, when you're at this crossroad and you're tempted to serve another, and you will be, and I will be, and we will be, he says, Joshua says, you've got to make a choice. And Jesus says, because you can't serve two masters. What do you do when you're at a crossroad? Jesus says this. He says, choose the narrow path. When you find yourself at a crossroad, he says, look for the narrow path. But be mindful, there's going to be another path. It's the wide road. It's the easy road. It's the road with all the choices and all the options. It's the road with all of the flavors of the day. Jesus says, pick the narrow path. In Matthew 7:13, he says, enter through the narrow gate. For wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. That's the thing, when you're at the crossroad, you get so confused because it looks like everybody else is going this way. Why does it look like I'm the only one not going to the party? But the problem is you don't see where that road bends to. He says, take the narrow path. And the thing about the narrow path is there aren't a lot of there's no options on the narrow path. There's no options on it. It's when you get on the narrow path, it's where the path goes. Jesus says, I am the way. I am the truth. I am the life. When you get on this path, is one way, and his name is Jesus. There's no room for all this other stuff and all these other... No, it's the narrow path. And you have to walk circumspectly on the narrow path. You got to be, as the psalmist says, he's got to give you hinds feet so that you can stay secure on the narrow path. On the wide path, boy, you can cut a rug on the wide path. You can do all kind of stuff on the wide, but not on the narrow path. Small is the gate and narrow is the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. You're at a crossroad, look for the narrow path. When you're at a crossroad, Jesus, he says this, that you have to be willing to deny yourself. This is one I don't like. He says you've got to be willing to deny yourself. In other words, there'll be a whole lot of choices, but you got to pick up the cross. There'll be a whole lot of options available to you, but he says, you have to make a decision to choose to say, I will deny myself. I will deny myself the opportunity to choose another. Jesus says you can learn so much about Jesus and what he expects even through the marriage relationship. When you enter into that covenant, what you're doing is you're not so much saying a resounding yes as much as you're saying a resounding no. Because that yes is full of a million no's. Isn't that true? Right? There are a bunch of beautiful women in the earth. People out, don't say that out loud, Pastor Lil. I don't know why y'all looking at me like that. Y'all see them too. What? I mean, right? My wife doesn't see any other beautiful men. I'm the only beautiful man in her eyes. But what we say is we say no to everything. It's not that the option isn't there. It's not that the temptation isn't there. It's not that the opportunity isn't there. It's just my yes is full of a big no. I have to deny myself. Jesus puts it this way in Matthew 16:24. He says, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. You're going to be at a crossroads. Some of you are sitting here today and you're at a crossroads. You've been coming to church but you haven't made a resounding yes to the Lord Jesus Christ. You've got some Jesus, but you want to mix it with some other stuff. You want to hang on to the stuff from your past. That's what he was saying when he said, you can worship the gods of your ancestors. In other words, there's some things in my past that I still want to keep in the future. And God is saying, the future that I have for you doesn't include this. And so in order for you to walk into the promise and the fulfillment and receive everything that God has for you, you're going to have to deny yourself. I tell you, here's the rough thing about denial is that so many times that we think that we're missing out on something, and what we don't realize is that God has your best interest at heart. God wants the best for you. And just because it comes with resistance, just because it takes time, just because you've got to battle for it, just because it requires patience and all of these things, I want you to know it is worth the wait. It's worth the fight. It's worth the resistance. It's worth denying yourself. It's worth it. It's worth it. When we look at the Israelites, we look at them with disgust and disdain. How could you possibly turn your back on God when he had this promise for you? Houses you didn't build, farms you didn't plow. But we do the same thing. And because we're tempted, we come to this crossroad, and instead of denying ourselves, we want a mixture. We want to create the flavor of the month. We want a little bit of the culture and a little bit of Christianity. And he says, Joshua says, you're going to have to. And then finally, when you're at a crossroad, Solomon, who was the richest man that lived, Solomon had wives on top of wives. He had options. He had children. I don't know how he managed that, but he had options. He had choices. He could have whatever he wanted. He had the money to buy it. He had all the, not only that, but he had wisdom. And you know what Solomon says? You know what his advice is? You know what he would say if you were at a crossroad, and we all are? He says this: trust with all your heart. Don't divide your heart. Don't trust in this and God. He says, trust in the Lord with all your heart. He says, don't lean on your own understanding. But he says, in all your ways, in Proverbs 3, verses 5 and 6, he says, submit to him, and he will make your path straight. When you come to the crossroad, if you trust in him and lean not unto your own understanding, he will direct your path. Let's face it. Help me, Joel. Let's face it. All of us are looking for our path. Which way do I go? Which way do I go? What's the direction that I should be moving in today? And Satan is going to do his very best to create options for you. And Joshua says this to the Israelites. And he's saying it to you, and he's saying it to me today. Choose today. Resolve today. Settle it today. Make it crystal clear today. Determine in your heart and in your mind that today I will serve. Joshua says, listen, you got to make a choice. But then I love this. My prayer today, and I want to pray for some people today. My prayer today is that God would raise up some Joshuas in some households. Joshua says this: I'm not sure what my kids want to do. I'm not even sure what my wife wants to do. But here's the confession over our home. As for me and my house, we will serve Lord. You know what? I don't even know if he asked anybody in the house. I don't know if he got a consensus. Hey, how y'all feel about this? He said, I'm going to speak over my house. As the leader of this house, as for me and my house, I know Bubba acting the fool today, but we will. I'm wondering if you're willing to make that confession today. As for me and my house. Maybe your house is just you. As for me and my house. Maybe you don't have a husband in the home. As for me and my house. Maybe everybody is acting the monkey, but as for me and I'm going to declare it over the entire, as the pastor of Light of the World, as for me and my house, we will serve. Would you stand with me this morning? When you're at a crossroad, trying to figure it out. Solomon says, man, just trust in the Lord. Don't even try to lean on your own understanding. He will direct your path.